April 1946. The war had been over for nearly a year, but for the women inside the makeshift POW camp near Hamburg, peace still hadn't arrived. The barbed wire still sang in the wind, the searchlights still swept the night, and the British guards still looked at them as if the uniforms had never come off. The camp had once been a Luftwaffe training ground. Now it held 237 German women, former anti-aircraft spotters, radio operators, clerks, nurses, and in a few cases, assistants who once served near the front. The townspeople called them Hitler's angels. The name stung more than any rationed hunger. That morning, the air carried the smell of wet pine and burned coal. A light rain fell, washing the last traces of snow from the roofs of the barracks. Inside, 20 women huddled near a small iron stove, trading cigarettes for pieces of bread, listening to the faint chime of distant church bells. "It's Sunday again," muttered one of them. "Do you think they pray for us too?" Nobody answered. Outside the camp fence, British soldiers stood in pairs, rifles slung, talking quietly. One of them, Corporal James Whitaker, pointed toward the camp and said something that made his friend laugh. The phrase drifted in the cold air. They'd burst into flames if they ever stepped inside a church. That joke would soon echo louder than either of them imagined. The local vicar, Captain Edward Hale, was a military chaplain who had lost his younger brother over Arnhem. He'd seen war's cruelty firsthand, and it left him not with bitterness, but with exhaustion. That week, he walked into the camp commandant's office and said, simply, "I want to invite them to service this Sunday." The commandant nearly choked on his tea. "The German women? The prisoners?" Hale nodded. "Yes, Christ didn't draw borders. Neither should I." The room went silent except for the hiss of the teapot. "You'll start a riot," the officer warned. "The villagers lost sons to them. The choir itself is full of widows." But Hale only smiled faintly. "Then maybe they need the sermon more than I do." Word spread like fire through the camp that afternoon. "The British priest wants us at church." Some laughed bitterly. Others froze, unsure if it was mockery or mercy. Inside Barrack 7, Anna Weiss, a 26-year-old former communications operator from Bremen, folded her thin blanket over her knees. She had joined the Luftwaffe at 19, when the sky still belonged to Germany. She'd watched it turn red over Berlin and black over Dresden. When she heard about the church invitation, her first thought was trap. "It's humiliation disguised as kindness," she told her bunkmate, Elsa Baum, a nurse. "They'll stare at us, make us kneel for what the men did." Elsa disagreed. "Maybe they want peace." "Peace," Anna whispered. "Peace is for the victors." But that night, as she lay awake, Anna couldn't stop hearing the bells. They were soft, rhythmic, unrelenting, like a heartbeat from the world outside the wire. By Sunday morning, the rain had cleared. The guards opened the gate, and 20 names were called. Only 12 women stepped forward. The others remained in their bunks, pretending not to hear. The chosen group lined up silently. No uniforms, no insignia, just plain gray coats and weary eyes. A few carried small crosses around their necks, hidden until now. Hale himself met them at the gate, offering a hesitant smile. "You're welcome as guests, not as prisoners." They walked out under armed escort, through the muddy lane leading to the village. The locals stopped and stared. A milkman froze mid-step. A widow carrying flowers turned away. Children pointed and whispered. One old man spat on the ground. "Let them burn in their own ruins," he muttered. The women said nothing. Every step felt heavier than their rations, heavier than the guilt that had no words in any language. When they reached the small stone church, Hale held the door open. The organ inside was playing softly, an old hymn in English they couldn't fully understand. As the women entered, all sound seemed to fade. The congregation turned their heads. A few gasped. Others stood rigid, faces pale with disbelief. The choir stopped mid-verse. Anna felt her legs tremble. Elsa's hands shook so hard she nearly dropped her scarf. The women took the back pews, heads bowed. For a moment no one moved. Even Hale's voice caught in his throat when he began. We gather today not as victors or defeated, but as human souls seeking light after darkness. His sermon spoke of forgiveness, of wounds that only mercy could heal, of nations learning to breathe again. But most of the villagers weren't listening. They stared at the women who had once been the enemy. Some eyes burned with hate, others with confusion. Halfway through the service, something strange happened. As the choir resumed a hymn, "Abide with me," one of the German women began to hum softly under her breath. It was barely audible, a trembling echo of melody. It was Anna. She didn't mean to sing. It simply slipped out, a reflex born from memory. For years, hymns had been her only refuge during bomb raids and blackouts. Elsa nudged her, whispering, "Stop! They'll hear." But it was too late. The sound carried. The air inside the church shifted. The British choir faltered again. For one strange moment, both sides seemed to forget who they were supposed to hate. After the service, silence hung like fog. The women filed out, eyes downcast. Hale shook each of their hands. The guards waited by the gate, unsure whether to salute or look away. When Anna passed the vicar, she whispered, "Why did you do this?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because hatred is the last prisoner to be released." That sentence would travel farther than he ever imagined. Back in the camp, the women sat quietly in their barracks. No one spoke for nearly an hour. Then Elsa finally whispered, "They looked at us like ghosts." Anna nodded. "Maybe that's what we are." She stared at her hands, scarred, calloused, trembling, and thought about the organ's trembling notes still echoing in her ears. For the first time since the war, she didn't feel like an officer or a prisoner or a German, just a human being who had survived something too big to name. Outside, the church bells rang again. The guards lit cigarettes, talking quietly, stealing glances toward the barbed wire. Corporal Whitaker, the one who'd once joked about them burning in church, muttered under his breath, "Never thought I'd see the day." His friend asked, "See what?" Whitaker exhaled smoke and stared at the horizon. The war actually ending. But inside that camp, something deeper had begun. The invitation that was meant as a gesture of charity had turned into something the British and Germans alike couldn't quite define. The women had gone to church as prisoners, but they'd returned carrying a silence that felt different. Less of shame, more of awakening. It was the first crack in a wall of hatred that had seemed unbreakable. And soon that silence would become a song. That night the camp did not sleep. The women lay in their bunks listening to the rain tapping against the tin roof, the occasional whistle of the wind cutting through the cracks. Somewhere in the dark, a woman was crying softly into her blanket. No one asked who. There was too much shame to share, and too little comfort to give. Anna Weiss stared at the ceiling. She could still feel the smooth grain of the wooden pew beneath her hands, still hear the organ trembling like a heartbeat she hadn't realized she'd missed. She tried to hate it, tried to summon the anger she'd carried for years, but the melody had slipped into her mind like light through broken glass. She remembered the faces of the villagers, the hostility, the disbelief, and beneath it all, something she couldn't name. Maybe pity, maybe confusion, maybe forgiveness trying to crawl its way through grief. She hated how much it haunted her. In the morning, Elsa found her sitting by the fence, staring through the mist. "You haven't eaten," Elsa said quietly. Anna shrugged. "Not hungry." Elsa hesitated, then sat beside her. "You shouldn't have sung." "I know. They could punish you." Anna smiled bitterly. "For singing? After all we've done, that would be merciful." They sat in silence for a long moment. Beyond the wire, the world was waking. British trucks rumbled down the dirt road, carrying supplies to towns still scarred by war. Somewhere far off, the same church bell rang again. "Do you think they'll invite us back?" Elsa asked. Anna didn't answer. The invitation came 3 days later. A guard appeared at roll call, reading from a folded note. "Chaplain Hale requests that any prisoners wishing to attend next Sunday's service may do so voluntarily." Voluntarily. The word hung in the cold air like a challenge. This time, more hands rose. 28 women. A few did it out of faith, others out of curiosity. And some, like Anna, because something inside them refused to stay silent. But not everyone approved. In the corner of the barack, a tall woman with sharp eyes, Greta Vogel, a former SS auxiliary, snorted in disgust. You think kneeling beside the British will wash away what happened? Fools. They're laughing at you. Elsa bristled. You weren't there, Greta. I don't need to be, she spat. They killed our men, burned our cities. And now you want to pray with them? You disgrace the uniform. Anna turned sharply. The uniform is ashes. You should let it burn. The two women locked eyes, years of propaganda and pain colliding in a single, heavy silence. It took two others to step between them. The war, it seemed, was not yet over. It had only changed walls. That week, Hale visited the camp again. He came without guards, carrying a wooden crate filled with old hymn books, German and English editions side by side. The women stared suspiciously as he placed them on a bench. You may use them if you wish, he said softly. Or not at all. I only ask that you bring your voices, not your hatred. Anna watched him carefully. His uniform was clean, his boots shining, but his eyes looked tired, like a man who had buried too many ghosts. One of the women finally asked, Why us? Why invite the enemy? Hale looked up. Because hatred is contagious. So is mercy. And only one of them ends wars. He left the crate behind. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Elsa stepped forward, picked up one of the hymn books, and brushed the dust off its cover. Anna followed. Then two more. And then the rest. In the days leading up to the next service, the camp changed. The women began humming softly during chores. Not loudly, never loud enough for the guards to notice, but enough to fill the silence between rations and roll calls. Sometimes it was hymns, sometimes old folk songs, sometimes half-remembered melodies from before the war, when the air still smelled of bread and laughter. The younger prisoners, who had never known a Germany before rubble and ration cards, listened in awe. You remember all that? One asked. Anna smiled faintly. You never forget songs that kept you alive. Sunday came again. This time, 30 women walked down the muddy road, escorted by only 2 guards instead of 4. The villagers still stared, but not with the same fury. Curiosity had replaced rage. The story of the singing prisoners had spread through the region like rumor or myth. Some came to church just to see if it was true. When they entered, the atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. The choir, all British women in black veils, hesitated at their benches. Hale began the service quietly. He spoke of 2 ruins, one of stone, one of spirit. He said rebuilding either required hands from both sides. Then, without warning, he gestured toward the women at the back. Would you lead us in the opening hymn? The entire church froze. Anna's heart stopped. She looked around, no one moved. The British looked stunned. Even Elsa's lips parted in disbelief. Hale met her eyes and gave a slow nod. Anna stood. Her knees shook so violently she gripped the pew for balance. And then she began to sing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't confident. But it was pure. The opening notes of Still Nacht, Silent Night, floated through the church like fragile glass. Her German words filled the air, trembling but unbroken. The sound rolled up the stone walls, across the altar, and into the rafters where swallows nested among the beams. Then another voice joined her. Elsa. Then a third. Then a fourth. Within moments, the back pew of German prisoners had become a quiet chorus. Their accents thick, their breath shallow, but the harmony undeniable. The British congregation sat motionless. The same song their soldiers had once sung across the trenches of the First World War was now returning through enemy voices. And then, in a ripple like wind through wheat, the English choir began to sing too, translating verse for verse. Silent night, holy night, the 2 languages intertwined like threads of the same wound. By the final verse, the sound filled every corner of the church. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't practiced. But it was human. When the last note faded, no one clapped. No one dared. The silence that followed was thicker than any applause. Some of the villagers were crying. A few of the guards turned away, pretending to check their rifles. For the first time since the war, there was no us and them in that small church. Only people trembling under the weight of the same memory. When they returned to the camp, even Greta, the hardened SS auxiliary, walked in silence. She said nothing. But that night, Anna heard her humming quietly under her breath. Elsa smiled from her bunk. Maybe we're all fools after all. Anna looked toward the sky, where the moon broke through the clouds like a lantern over the wire. Maybe that's how peace begins. Outside, the guards listened too. No one laughed this time. No one spoke. They simply stood there, letting the wind carry the echo of a song that had crossed from enemy to ally without firing a single shot. And for the first time since the fall of Germany, the war truly sounded over. The next morning, sunlight broke through the gray sky for the first time in weeks. It fell across the barbed wire like threads of gold. For months, that wire had been the symbol of everything that separated them from the world. Now, it shimmered like it wasn't meant to cage them anymore, but to remind them what they had survived. Inside the camp, a new sound had replaced the silence. Humming. It began with Anna, but it spread through the barracks, across the laundry lines, even among the guards. Someone whistled the tune of Silent Night while hauling coal. A British sentry caught himself humming along before stopping, embarrassed, glancing around to make sure no one heard. The prisoners noticed, and for the first time they smiled. The event spread like wildfire across the countryside. In nearby towns, Lübeck, Celle, Kiel, British soldiers told the story in pubs and mess halls. "You should have seen it," they said, shaking their heads in disbelief. "Those German women sang like angels. I swear." Even the vicar cried. Newspapers didn't print it. Not yet. The wounds of war were still too raw. But word traveled the old-fashioned way. By rumor, by whisper, by memory. To some, it was scandalous. How dare they let war criminals sing in a church? One woman spat at a market stall. To others, it was holy. "If God forgave them, perhaps we can forgive ourselves," said an old farmer who'd lost his son in Normandy. But inside the camp, the women didn't care how the world debated them. Something inside had shifted, small, fragile, but real. The hatred that had fed them for years had begun to starve. Chaplain Hale felt it too. He'd written dozens of sermons during the war, but none had stirred him like that moment when two languages fused into one hymn. "That song was more powerful than the peace treaty," he wrote in his journal that night. When he returned the following Sunday, he brought a small gramophone. It was cracked and dented, scavenged from a ruined school. He set it on a table in the camp yard, wound the handle, and placed the needle. The women gathered, cautious but curious. The record hissed, then a melody emerged, faint, scratchy, but unmistakable. A British military choir singing Abide With Me. Hale stood before them. "Music," he said softly, "is the only language war can't silence." He handed Anna the record sleeve, faded and torn, and said, "Next week, you'll sing it." The camp guards didn't know what to make of it. These women, once distant, bitter, unbroken, now sang while scrubbing the floors and mending uniforms. One officer reported it in his daily log as a curious rise in morale among detainees. But it wasn't morale. It was resurrection. Greta Vogel, once the loudest cynic, had begun teaching others harmonies. Elsa had organized a small choir of 12. Anna had started translating hymns from English to German so they could sing together without pause. They didn't have instruments, but they had rhythm. Their hands clapping softly on tabletops, spoons against cups, feet tapping against the floorboards. The camp, once defined by silence, now pulsed with life. A week later, when the group arrived at the church again, something remarkable happened. The villagers had already gathered outside, not to jeer this time, but to listen. Word had spread far beyond the parish. Families came from neighboring towns just to see the singing prisoners. Journalists from the Allied News Service arrived quietly, notepads hidden in their coats. Even a few officers from headquarters came to witness the phenomenon that nobody could quite explain. When the women entered, the congregation stood, not in protest, but in respect. The organ began, and this time, there was no hesitation. The British choir started first. Then, as planned, the German women's voices rose to meet them, verse by verse, English and German intertwining in perfect rhythm. The sound filled the stone church like sunlight flooding through stained glass. Every note felt like a prayer, every breath a confession. Tears ran freely from both sides, and then, mid-song, something unexpected happened. A child, no older than 6, broke free from his mother's arms and walked up the aisle toward the prisoner's pew. His mother gasped, whispering, "Peter, no." But the boy kept walking until he reached Anna, his small hand holding a single white flower, a daisy, picked from the field outside. He offered it to her without a word. Anna froze, her throat locked. Then, slowly, she knelt, taking the flower in trembling fingers. She pressed it against her chest and whispered, "Danke." No one breathed, not even the organist. That image, a German prisoner kneeling before a British child, would become the moment the entire town remembered for decades. By the end of the service, something irreversible had happened. The hatred that had once poisoned every look and every word was gone. In its place was something no treaty could legislate: recognition, humanity. After the final hymn, the British choir approached the Germans. The women didn't know what to do. Salute? Bow? Apologize? But one British widow, her husband's name etched on a Normandy grave, stepped forward and embraced Anna. "He would have wanted this," she whispered. Anna couldn't reply. Tears streamed down her face. Elsa sobbed openly beside her. Even Greta turned away, her jaw trembling. The guards didn't stop them. No one did. That night, Hale wrote to his superiors, "Something extraordinary is happening here. These women who once served tyranny are now serving harmony. They sing like they're asking the world to start again. If reconciliation is possible anywhere, it begins in this chapel." He didn't know that his letter would later circulate through Allied command and reach London, nor that, months later, British officers would authorize music programs in other POW camps across Europe, hoping to replicate what became known quietly as the Choir of Forgiveness. Within a year, more than 4,000 German women held in Allied camps participated in similar services. Some sang, some wept, many for the first time prayed, but none of them forgot that first moment, that small church near Hamburg where a hymn bridged the abyss. When Anna and the others returned to camp that day, the guards saluted them informally. Not mockingly, not sarcastically, respectfully. The British flag still fluttered above the gate, but something invisible had changed. The women were still prisoners by law, but not by spirit. Greta whispered that night, "We used to raise our voices for orders. Now we raise them for peace. Maybe this is what winning feels like." Anna nodded. Maybe it's what being forgiven feels like. In the weeks that followed, they performed again, not just for the villagers, but for wounded British soldiers, war orphans, and even visiting Red Cross officials. Newspapers finally printed the story under the headline, "Enemies Sing Together. British and German women find peace in harmony." Radio broadcasts replayed snippets of their performances. A BBC journalist described it as a sound the world forgot it needed. And when he asked Anna what compelled her to sing that first day, she answered quietly, "Because silence is where hate hides." By the end of 1947, many of the women were released. But the song remained, in recordings, in memories, in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. One British soldier, years later, wrote in his diary, "I fought across Europe, but I never saw victory until I saw forgiveness." The tables had turned in a way no one had predicted. Not through bullets or banners, but through voices. The mockery had become a miracle. The captives had become the teachers. And the song that began with fear had ended in awe. The war was supposed to have ended in 1945. But for many, the fighting never truly stopped. It simply moved inward, into memories, into silence, into the small, unspoken corners of the soul where guilt and grief built their own walls. Yet in that small town outside Hamburg, something extraordinary had begun to erode those walls. The Choir of Forgiveness, as the locals quietly called it, became more than a curiosity. It became a phenomenon. By winter of 1947, the story had reached the desks of officials in London and Berlin alike. The British viewed it as a model for post-war rehabilitation, a rare example of hearts softening before politics caught up. The Germans saw it as a strange but beautiful rumor, that even the enemy could offer grace before their own nation had found its footing again. But for the women who had lived it, for Anna, Elsa, and the rest, it was not politics. It was survival of a different kind. The day they were released, the world felt alien. The barbed wire that had once defined their world was cut and rolled away, the guard towers dismantled. A British officer handed each woman a stamped document and a small ration pack. Repatriation, he called it, but the word sounded hollow. How do you go back to a country that no longer exists? Anna carried little. Just a small cloth bag and a folded scrap of paper containing the lyrics of Silent Night in both German and English. She had copied it by hand, her writing trembling but neat. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a map, a reminder of the strange path that had led her from hatred to harmony. When the train carried them across the border, the women pressed their faces to the windows. Germany was a skeleton of itself. Burned fields, broken bridges, hollow-eyed children scavenging through the rubble. The war had not ended here. It had simply changed shape. Elsa whispered, "What do we do now?" Anna answered softly, "We rebuild, even if it's only one note at a time." For years, the women lived quietly. Most avoided speaking of the past. Their neighbors knew or pretended not to. Some faced scorn. Others married and started anew. But the memory of that church, that song, lingered like a haunting perfume. In 1951, letters began to arrive. Handwritten, faded, but unmistakably English. They were from villagers, from choir members, even from British soldiers who had attended those services. Each letter carried the same refrain: "We still remember your song." One envelope bore the familiar name Reverend Edward Hale. Inside, a simple message written in neat cursive: "Dear Anna, I am leaving the service soon, but I wanted you to know, every Christmas Eve, our choir still sings, still nacht, in German. We never changed it back." Anna read it aloud to Elsa, her hands trembling. Neither spoke for a long while. Then Elsa said, "We sang once for forgiveness. Now they sing for remembrance." By the late 1950s, time had thinned the ranks of that once captive choir. Some emigrated to America or Canada. Others faded into the anonymity of post-war recovery. Anna settled in Bremen, working as a seamstress. She rarely spoke of the camp, though sometimes, while sewing, she would hum under her breath. When asked why, she would smile faintly and say, "Because silence is heavy. Music keeps it from crushing you." Elsa became a nurse again, this time in a hospital that treated both German and British veterans. She kept one photo on her desk. The church choir, British and German women standing side by side, faces solemn but eyes bright. People would ask, "Who are they?" She'd reply, "Women who ended a war without guns." In 1963, nearly 20 years after that first church service, a small reunion was arranged in the same town. The old church had been rebuilt, its roof repaired, its bell recast from the melted remains of wartime shells. Hale had long since retired but returned as a guest of honor. His hair was white now, his frame thinner, but his eyes were the same, warm, steady, carrying decades of both sorrow and faith. When Anna arrived, she hesitated at the doorway. The pews were filled with faces, some familiar, many new. A new generation sat where their parents once glared. Hale greeted her with a smile that erased 20 years in a heartbeat. "I told you, Miss Weiss," he said softly. "Hatred is the last prisoner to be released." She handed him something, a small, pressed daisy sealed in glass. "From Peter," she said. He blinked. "The boy?" "Yes, he sent it before he died last winter. Said it belonged where the song began." When the choir began to sing that night, the sound was softer, older, slower, but no less powerful. The words carried through the rebuilt rafters, echoing off the same stone that had once heard both scorn and grace. This time, no reporters came. No officers, no cameras. Only townspeople, veterans, and their children. And when the final verse faded, no one applauded. They simply sat in silence, as if afraid to disturb what had been created there 2 decades before. After the service, Hale stood at the altar one last time. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. History remembers victories and losses, but rarely the quiet acts that heal them. This song, your song, was one such act. It reminded us that even in the ruins of war, forgiveness can still rise and sing. Anna never sang publicly again after that night. She returned to Bremen and grew old quietly, surrounded by her students and the distant hum of a city reborn. Yet every Christmas Eve, she would stand by her window and listen to the carols drifting through the streets. And somewhere, always, there was still Nacht. Neighbors sometimes joined her without knowing the reason. She never explained. She didn't need to. When she passed away in 1988, her belongings were few. A silver cross, a handful of sewing tools, and a faded letter from Hale, still folded neatly inside a hymn book. On the first page, written in her own handwriting, were the words, "They said we'd burn in church, but we found light instead." Years later, historians rediscovered the story through British military records. In one memo, dated April 1946, an officer had written simply, "Chaplain Hale requests permission to invite German female POWs to Sunday service. Risk of unrest minimal." No one could have imagined that a single line of ink would lead to a moment that changed hearts across 2 nations. The original church still stands today. On its stone wall, a small plaque reads, "To the women who sang, enemies once, sisters forever." Every Christmas, visitors come to hear the modern choir perform the same hymn in both languages. And every year, when the first notes rise, someone in the audience begins to cry, though they might not even know why. The story of the singing prisoners reminds us that wars are fought by nations, but peace is made by individuals. That forgiveness, once unthinkable, often begins with a single act of courage, a voice trembling against the tide of history. The irony lingers still. What began as an insult, they'd burst into flames if they ever stepped inside a church, became the moment the world saw them shine. Because sometimes, light comes from where the world expects only ashes. Hatred ends not in surrender, but in song. Reverend Edward Hale, 1963. If forgiveness could heal the wounds of a world war, what could it do for us today?